you know, I had clients who were in such dire situations that all I could do was really help buffer them against that. But they were a minority. I wouldn't say more than 5% of my practice fell into that category. Everyone else, it was like just rapid improvement on all fronts, you know. And that's such fun. And there isn't anything more practical. This is the thing too. There is nothing more practical than developing a vision. It's not some pie in the sky exercise. Without a vision, you're chaotic and fragmented and hopeless and disappointed, and someone can stop you just by putting up a single obstacle. You're a house divided amongst itself. You have no forward movement. You're not enthusiastic, and that's to be filled with the Spirit of God, by the way. And your life is a sequence of disappointments and frustrations and tragedies, and you're a leaf blowing in the wind. And that is not what you're called to be. That's not what you're called to be. You're called to be a visionary constructor of the paradisal vision. Mm-hmm. Really? Really? That's who you are. Terrible as that is to apprehend. And so,
well, what do we have to lose?
We already will lose everything we have to lose.
Yeah.
Right? We're all in this game, man. So there's, whether you want it to be this way or not, you are betting everything on your life. So now you're moving towards the promised land, let's say. So that's inspiring, and that produces positive emotion, because you experience positive emotion when you see yourself moving towards a valued goal. No valued goal, no positive emotion. That's how your systems are set up psychophysiologically. On the negative front, well, maybe anger and bitterness and fear stop you. Okay, so what do you do with them? Okay, now, take good stock of your sinful nature, let's say. You know what temptations you're prone to and what knock you off the beaten track, and maybe you feel guilty about it. You know where your weaknesses are, and you probably have some idea of just what kind of hell you could inhabit if you let those weaknesses get the upper hand. So why don't you just write about that for 15 minutes? So let's say this isn't what you could have in 5 years. It's the pit you could dig for yourself if you decided to, you know, just sit there or dig. Everyone has a sense of that, you know, for some people. My temptation probably would have been alcohol. It calmed me in social situations. It made me feel a closer kinship to people, and it was a pretty good stimulant. And so it was a really good drug for me, and I enjoyed it quite a lot, too much. But I learned that I had better things to do. I wouldn't have stopped without better things to do. And that's
And what did you mean by better things to do?
Well, I was writing my book, Maps of Meaning, when I was still carousing as a graduate student. I'd started to put my life together by that point quite a bit, but I was still a party animal and very social. And but I found that I couldn't think hungover. And not only that, I couldn't handle the emotional tension of what I was dealing with intellectually. It was too, because you know, if you're hungover, your emotions are more sensitive, especially your anxiety. And the work I was doing was way too demanding emotionally, because I was dealing with historical atrocity, and the motivations for that was just too damn dark, you know, to be dealing with hungover. Plus, once I had written a fair bit and was editing, once you've edited your work to a substantial degree, you have to use finer and finer gradations of judgment to continue to improve it. And if you're fuzzy-minded at all, if you've impaired your judgment, when you edit, you can make it worse, not better. And then I also realized that the only times I really regretted my actions was when I was drinking, because it disinhibits you, and that's fun. That can be really fun. But I'd wake up the next day and think, yeah, I was a little too provocative, I was a little too aggressive, I was a little too mean-spirited in my wit, a little too egotistical, or maybe more than little on all of those fronts. A little careless in my choice of partner, a little uncontrolled in my social behavior in places I shouldn't have been, because, you know, I was starting to, well, I was a graduate student and a teacher by that point, and I was interacting with professors, say, in the social milieu.
As the responsibility grew.
Yeah, well, it wasn't time to be drunk. That just wasn't good. That worked in northern Alberta to some degree in some subcultures, but in those situations it just made me look like a fool. Well, it made me into a fool, not just look like one. And then when you and I got married, I didn't, and we were going to have kids, I thought, well, I'm not drinking when I have kids.
Yeah, I wanted children.
Yeah, and you know, you want to grow up at that point. And besides, I was ready to dispense with all of that by then. People are often afraid of moving forward, and no wonder. But you should be way more afraid of not moving forward. And so if you get that hell behind you, it's like, well, do I want to go there? Well, I don't have the effort or the energy. I'm not even sure that it's the right thing. It's like, well, do I want to go back there? It's like, no, definitely not that. And if you don't feel that, hell, then you're not nearly as motivated as you could be. Because if you have any sense of just exactly how bloody dismal and dark things could get, then, and that's right there for you. And that was one thing that...
I thought it was helpful. I thought it was helpful when I did the future authoring to think about where I would go if I went to the wrong place.
Why?
Well, it's just good to know how you will fall apart.
Yeah, well,
that
and then
it's
you
possible?
can. Well, and you can also ask yourself, and studying historical atrocity also helped me with that. It's like, well, do you want to be a what would you call a sadist? You're bitter and resentful. You want to hurt other people? Is that where you want to end up? You want to lie and deceive? Because that's where you end up if you lie and deceive. You want to be resentful and bitter? Because that's where you end up if you're resentful and bitter.
Yeah, but sometimes, you know, people, they just don't know what to do about it. So your program helps them to make a plan.
Yeah, well, and the plan is really, look, we're visionaries, man. Human beings are visionaries. Really.
Well, I found when I did the self-authoring, the 15 minutes of writing that I did, the dreaming I did,
yeah.
when I wrote about my future and just dreamed of what it could be like if it was just what I wanted.
Yeah.
And then outlined the goals, because you outline goals after that in the future authoring. Those things that I had identified appeared in my life. Those.
Yeah, well.
And that was quite shocking to me.
Well, the thing is, you look at the world through a goal-directed framework. And so when you switch your goals, what appears to you in the world switches. It's mystical in a sense, but in another sense, it's just understandable. It's like, well, if I look that way, I see the TV and the couch, and if I look this way, I see you in the chair. Well, that's not that mysterious, but what I've done is I've changed the reality that manifests itself to me just by changing the direction of my orientation. Well, we do that metaphysically as well. And so, for example, if you decide that you're going to be courageously trusting towards people when they offer you an opportunity, even though you're skeptical and timid, but you decide, no, I'm going to have some faith in people, so I'm going to be courageous and trusting, then when they open a door to you that's an opportunity, you'll think, oh, that's a door I could walk through, instead of thinking I'm moving into a trap. And it's the same reality in some sense, but the way that you're interacting with it changes. Well, it can change. It can invert. It can change so radically that it barely looks like you're living in the same world. There are a lot of potential interpretations that you can validly lay on the world, and some of them are extremely positive, and they still work. And wouldn't that be lovely if you could lay an incredibly positive vision on the world in a calculating and strategic manner, not an instrumental manner, right? Because you're aiming at something genuinely good, and that would work. And that is how the world works. One of the things I loved, maybe we can end with this too, one of the things I loved about my clinical practice, I loved this. It was so good, and I miss it. We were always working, the best parts of me and my client were working together to make everything about their lives better. And it worked. You know, like I had lots of female clients who tripled their income in 4 years. They didn't even think that was possible. It's like, well, I don't make enough money, I'm barely making ends meet, single mothers, I have no idea what to do, I don't like my job. It's like, well, let's make a plan here. You know, what do you want? well, I'd like to make this much money. Why don't we double that? And just, because you're going to aim at something. Some people do make more money than that, so maybe it could be you. Well, is that even it's not even possible. It's like, well, let's just assume that maybe it's possible and see what you'd have to do. Well, you got to get your CV together. Well, it's full of holes. Okay, well, let's fix the holes. Okay, now you got to get a plan. Well, I'm not very good at interviews. Okay, let's practice interviewing till you're not just good at it, you're looking forward to it. So Carl Jung, the psychoanalyst, said the fool is the precursor to the savior. Why? Because the fool will tell the truth, right? And you can't redeem yourself without telling the truth. And in the court, so the court might be the place where the evil king rules. And that's one possibility, the king's court. Maybe the evil king is ruling. Well, you need a fool. Why? Well, the fool's beneath contempt. So the fool can say anything. Well, so is the fool or the king? Because if the fool is the only person free enough to say anything, it's not obvious that the king is in control. It might be the fool's in control that has the real power.
But he doesn't have the responsibility that goes with that.
Well, he has the responsibility to be funny.
Right, okay.
Right, well, so that is a responsibility. Yeah. It's a responsibility to tell the truth. Mm-hmm. Now, he's not the administrator, right? But at least he's the person who's feeding truth into the culture. And certainly comedians do that. Like one marker of someone you can't trust is, well, I have no sense of humor. I don't see why that's funny. It's like, yeah, you don't. That's pretty sad. There's some things comedians shouldn't be allowed to make fun of. It's like, yeah, you're going to decide that, are you? You're going to decide what people get to think is funny, this unconscious manifestation. You're going to regulate that. And you're going to claim pridefully that, well, yeah, I'm going to regulate that and things will be a hell of a lot better because of it. It's like, yeah, if you're the sort of tyrant that can't stand if you're the sort of king that can't stand the fool, then you're a tyrant. I'd like to be remembered, I suppose, as someone who was encouraging, because that's what I think primarily I'm doing, is encouraging people. It's like, yeah, you're full of problems and you're massive snakes and all that, but not fundamentally. You're the thing that can handle snakes fundamentally. Mm-hmm. So if you would be willing to. And I not only do I believe that in some sense, I know it's true. Mm-hmm. I know it's true. So I'm trying to tell people that. It's like, yeah, you're a sad case, but there's a hell of a lot more to you than you think, like way more. Enough to cope with the trouble of the world inside you. There's enough to cope with the trouble of the world. And if you had enough courage, you could let that out. Enough courage and faith, you could let that out, and everything would be better because of it. My dad was a school teacher. He's still alive. And he got disenchanted with school teaching in part because all of the authority in his classroom was taken from him. So if there were disciplinary issues in the class, it had to be brought up the hierarchy to the administrative echelons above him. And so he could feel his authority in the class slipping away. And he was quite an authoritative teacher. My dad was my teacher in grade 6. For math. I wasn't in his homeroom, but I remember, and by grade 6, this is about 12 years old, kids are pretty pushy and fractious, and 10 minutes before the class started, the first time my dad walked into the room, everyone was silent because he had a reputation, and the reputation was, don't mess with him. And it wasn't because he was mean. He had a hard spine, and you didn't want to push him, but he was authoritative. And he also got disenchanted with television. So when he was young, and even when I was young, there were shows like My Three Sons and Father Knows Best. Can you imagine a show called Father Knows Best now? The closest I've seen to that recently is Ted Lasso. That's the only sitcom I've seen for like 5 decades in some sense that has a genuinely positive male lead. So kudos to Ted Lasso. You see that a little bit in The Simpsons, hey? Because that's why it was such an interestingly subversive show, because Homer's a bumbling fool. And Marge, in some sense, has the moral upper hand, but not entirely. But Homer, the thing about Homer is he's trying. He's not very bright, but he is trying. And he would like to be a good father, and he's faithful to his wife and his kids. And so there is this underlying solidity of that male character, but, it's damning with faint praise. And now young men, they're under assault from two directions, fundamentally. One is all male authority is nothing but patriarchal oppression. And so imagine now you're an ambitious young man, which is the drive toward that authority. Well, all that is a manifestation of the power dynamic in men that produced the patriarchal oppressive colonial tyranny. And so now you're a moral young man. You think, well, my ambition is to be not only to be questioned, it's to be squelched entirely, because it's nothing but a manifestation of power. Imagine that maybe you escape from that by some maneuvering, but then there's another assault that's waiting, which is all human activity is nothing but part of the force that's devouring the planet and that's going to put us all in flames. It's like, oh good, so not only am I part of the patriarchal oppressive force, but I'm also the despoiler of Mother Nature. And so if you tell boys that constantly, and you do, and then you also say all of the sexual advances that you make towards women on any front whatsoever are to be regarded with extreme skepticism, and then you feed them pornography on a non-stop basis, so there's an easy way out, and that's an unbelievably powerful...
Oh, it's a drug.
Oh, well, you know, no one really thinks this through in some sense, but any 12-year-old boy, 13-year-old boy can now see more beautiful naked women in 15 minutes than the richest king in history ever saw in his whole life. You think, well, you know, we don't have to worry about that. It's like, yeah, you have to worry about that. That's a huge problem, and it's a demoralizing problem because it offers an easy way out. If all of your ambition is nothing but the junior manifestation of power and should be squelched out of you as early as possible, and schools do this because they punish boys for playing, so hyperactivity looks like suppressed play behavior. So there's good animal models of that, by the way, and you can, if you deprive animals of play, especially juvenile male animals, a lot of this has been done with rats because they're very playful, by the way. If you deprive them of play, they'll play hyperactively when you give them the opportunity. And you can suppress that with methylphenidate. That's Ritalin. It suppresses play behavior. Now it focuses attention deficit. It's like, no, probably not. These boys just need to be out in the playground, running around playing like for more time than they're allowed with their boisterous competitive play behavior, you know, and we don't need competition. You know, all games should be cooperative, which is complete rubbish. It's not a game if it's just cooperative, and it's such a dopey view of cooperation. Like if you and I are playing one-on-one basketball, then, well, are we cooperating or competing? Well, did you bring a chessboard? No. You came to play basketball. Well, how about that's cooperation? We've decided what the rules are going to be. That's cooperation. Obviously, fundamental. We're playing the same game. That's cooperation. Think it through. And so then, are we competing? Well, yes, but what does that mean? It means, well, we're getting in each other's way in some sense while we're trying to hit the goal. But we're doing that in a way that improves our skill at hitting the goal. Because if you set up an obstacle to me, which is what you do if we're playing one-on-one basketball, you're making it difficult for me to hit the target. And so that means you're making me better at hitting the target. And if we do that optimally, then it's fun. The word sin is derived from a Greek word, hamartia, and there's a Jewish parallel semantic track, by the way, that has the same underlying structure. Hamartia is an archery term. It means to miss the target. And so what we're trying to do is hit the target. Well, what's the target? Well, that's the question. It's a hard question. But we're trying to hit the target. And how do you know? Well, what are people doing when they're playing sports? Like all sports, virtually, are circulate around hitting the target. It might be crossing the finish line first, so the target would be being the fastest among that group. So that would be swimming, let's say. Or it might be football, and all of its variants. Obviously, you're hitting the target. That's what basketball is. That's what shooting is. That's what archery is. It's all hitting the target. Now, we're hunting creatures. We're based on a hunting platform, and we're visual hunters too. And so we're looking at targets all the time and trying to hit them. And part of what we're doing when we're competing is we set a joint target, and then we set up an adversarial structure that improves our skill while we practice hitting the target. And so is that competition? It's like, well, no. It's not competition in that the goal is to defeat you, even though I'm going to try to win because otherwise the game's no fun. The real game is, can we make each other better in a sustainable way so that we can hit the target more effectively? And men, especially on the sports pitch, of course women do this too, but it's more of a masculine enterprise in some sense. It's a masculine enterprise, not a male enterprise, not for men only. It's honing your ability to hit the target. And when you deviate from the target, deviation from the target, that's sin. That's what it means. It's so useful to know that. It's like, well, I missed the mark, and then you're guilty about it. Well, you should be. You're supposed to hit the mark. And what's the mark? Well, the mark is the line between order and chaos. Or the mark is the playful engagement in good conversation. The mark is a really intense game. An intense game is you're serious about it. The person is pushing you right to your bloody limit, and vice versa. So why work 80 hours a week? Well, men will do it, some men, very few. A handful of hyper-competitive men who are obsessed with hitting the pinnacle of the given dominance hierarchy they're in will happily work 80 hours a week, and they'll forego everything else. Relationships, family, children, way in the second category. And so those men are often very difficult to live with too, because they're so obsessed with their career. It's hard to have a relationship with them. And maybe they don't have much of a relationship with their kids, but they're damn good at what they do. And part of that is they're smart and disciplined, and they'll work non-stop all the time. It's like an obsession. And that's the sort of people who run things. Those are the people who run things. Well, they're often also disagreeable too, because you want to manage people? Really? They're not going to like you. You know, and it's not an easy thing to not be liked. And actually, if you're an agreeable person, and women are more agreeable than men, it's quite painful to be disliked. But if you're in a managerial and executive position, the probability that people are going to like you is quite low. Those positions are very stressful, partly because of the interpersonal dynamics, and they're also incredibly, incredibly competitive. So we've got things backwards in our culture. We're thinking, at least in part, why aren't there more women in positions of power? Wrong question. The right question is, why are there any men at all who want those positions of power? Because it's not just positions of power. You have to be such a knothead to think that. Oh, it's a position of power. It's like, sure, but it's a position of overwhelming responsibility. And if you make mistakes, you're done. Right? It's not like you occupy that position of power and everyone does what they're told all the time and your life is easy. It's like, forget about that. People are on your case to do exactly the right thing all the time, 100% of the time. And maybe you want that and maybe you don't. So I don't know what people think is these people are all sitting in their offices with their feet up on the desk, smoking cigars and oppressing the world. It's like, that isn't how it works. Those people, they work flat out all the time. So, and it's fine if that's what you want, and some people are like that. They're hyper-industrious people, right? From a trait perspective, no matter where you put them. If you put them in a forest with an axe, they just wander around chopping down trees non-stop, right? Because it's built into them. But if you want to have a balanced life, and you should want that, you know, because the other thing you'll find, and this is God's gospel truth, is that the older you get, if you have any sense at all, the more important your family is to you. Like the utility of your career, maybe that peaks around 35 or 40, and it starts to decline pretty rapidly after that. And what happens, if you're fortunate, you have someone in your life that you love, that you've woven yourself together with, and you have some kids so that you have something to do from the time you're 50 till the time you're 80. And so it's a real mistake. It's a barren future without children, man. I can tell you that. It's a real mistake. And so we do a terrible job of say, putting that image forward and saying, well, yeah, now, you know, because women have access to the birth control pill now and can compete in the same domains as men, roughly speaking, there is a real practical problem here. It's partly an economic problem now, because when I was roughly your age, it was still possible for a one-income family to exist. Well, you know that wages have been flat, except in the upper 1% since 1973. Why? Well, it's easy. What happens when you double the labor force? What happens? You have the value of labor. So now we're in a situation where it takes two people to make as much as one did before. So we went from a situation where women's career opportunities were relatively limited, to where they were relatively unlimited, and there were two incomes, to where, and so women could work, to a situation where women have to work, and they only make half as much as they would have otherwise. And now we're going to go into a situation, this is the next step, whereas women will work because men won't. And that's what's coming now. So there was an economist article showing that 50% now of boys in school are having trouble with their basic subjects. And you look around you in universities, you can see this happening. I've watched it over decades. I would say 90% of the people in my personality class are now women. There won't be a damn man left in university in 10 years, except in the STEM fields. And it's a complete bloody catastrophe. And it's a catastrophe for women, because I don't know where the hell you're going to find someone to have a, to marry and have a family with if this keeps happening.
I talked to Frans de Waal 2 weeks ago, and that'll be out soon, and he's the world's greatest living primatologist, perhaps. De Waal's work is unbelievably important. It's unbelievably important because he's concentrated on the idea of the alpha male. And we have in popular parlance, we have an idea of the alpha chimp, right? Or the alpha male for that matter. And it's pretty much a postmodern neo-Marxist view of primate sociology. And that is that the biggest, ugliest, meanest male dominates by brute force, and so now he's at the top of the pyramid. And so the implicit claim there from the biologists is that power, those who express power most effectively, power being the ability to compel, those who express power most effectively will dominate the pyramid of dominance, of social hierarchy, and they'll prevail reproductively. Well, that's pretty gloomy, that idea, but people think, well, that's how you look at the world if you're sensible. It's like, well, Frans de Waal's been studying chimps for 30 years, and that's not true. That is not what happens. He told me flat out that frequently small male can become alpha, especially if he has the support of an influential female. And the small male becomes alpha and has the support of the influential female, not because he expresses arbitrary power, but because he's unbelievably good at mutual reciprocation. And so he has friends, and he does things for his friends, and they do things for him, and they trust each other, and he has lots of friends, which also means he has no enemies, which turns out to be really important, because the brute chimps, like the psychopath alphas, they do rule now and then, but they get torn to shreds by their enemies, because they're tough, let's say, and mean, but they have an off day, and two chimps they stomped a week before ally together and literally tear them into shreds. And so the psychopath chimp types who use power to attain dominance have very short rules and end in a very bloody way. And so de Waal has pointed out, like Piaget did among children, that power is an unstable ethic upon which to base a social hierarchy, even for chimps. And chimps are male-dominated, they have a patriarchal society, and they're relatively brutal. And it doesn't even work for them. It certainly doesn't work for human beings. So whatever's at the apex of the pyramid, it's not, as the bloody Marxists insist, the raw expression of power and exploitation. Wrong. Not the case. Doesn't even work in nature. Doesn't work for rats. Doesn't work for chimpanzees. Certainly doesn't work for people. And then there is a kind of natural ethic that emerges out of that, right? Because with rats and with chimps and other social animals, it varies to some degree from species to species, there's the necessity for something like mutual reciprocity as the basis for successful social organization. And that's something like treat your neighbor like you would want to be treated.
You watch all those rom-coms where there's always kind of a beta male guy who's being real friendly and always failing miserably with the women because basically he's lying to himself and to them. He's a persona. And a persona is the face that you show to the world when you're trying to pretend and to convince yourself and others that you're, I would say harmless, but we could say a good person. But a good person isn't harmless. A good person is capable of Well, maybe a good person is capable of anything, but is willing to hold that in abeyance. If you run, then the signal that the story you're acting out is that the thing you're running from is bigger than you and that you have to hide. And that's just a recipe for anxiety. Now, it's not necessarily that easy to turn and face something, but you do detail out a variety of strategies in your books that might help people do that. You can differentiate the problem. Like you might have been traumatized at work, let's say, or let's not use that sort of jargony phraseology. You may be having tremendous difficulties at work. You might be dealing with people who are tyrannical at work and find it very meaningless. And that's bothering you constantly. It's disturbing your sleep, for example, and it's haunting you. And you tend to try to push it out of your mind when the thoughts come. And partly that's because the thought of getting a new job is so daunting that you can't face it. And one of the ways of recalibrating that is to break down the problem into small and manageable steps. And so, for example, one of the things that you can do if you might have to consider getting a new job because you're unhappy and miserable at work is open up your resume or your CV and look at it, right? So you might not be able to get a new job, but you might be able to open up your resume and look at it. And then having done that, you've sort of cracked the surface, and then maybe you could spend an hour a week for a month updating it, or 10 minutes a day, or 10 minutes every 2 days, something like that. But part of the trick is to take these larger monsters that are frightening enough so you want to run away from them, decide that you're going to face the situation. You lay out, for example, in your book, you ask people a lot of different questions about what they're thinking. And if something is making you anxious and afraid and miserable, it's very useful to write out all the reasons it's making you anxious and miserable, and to ask yourself, what is it you're afraid of? And then to develop a differentiated plan for dealing with those. It might be very disheartening to see at what small scale you have to begin improvements, right? But the truth of the matter is that tends to scale exponentially. Is once you start making improvements, the improvements feed back upon themselves. And so even if you have to start out small, it doesn't take very long before you're on the upward trajectory, and it's not linear. You can fail precipitously, right? But you can also succeed precipitously. Once you get the ball rolling, positive things tend to aggregate together, and you can make a lot of progress even if you start from a pretty damn dismal place. So here's a very useful thing the psychoanalysts learn to do. So imagine you do go to a social occasion and you find as you enter the hall, you're getting nervous and sweaty. Now, if you watch, this is why Carl Jung, for example, believed that we lived through a dream. We lived life through a dream. And that's a story. And so what you'll see is that if you feel that nervousness and you attend to it, a little drama will run in your head in images. And it'll be something like, well, I'm going to go in here and no one's going to talk to me. And this will happen in pictures, like a little movie. No one's going to talk to me, and I'm going to end up in the corner, and I'm going to be bored, and I'm going to be sweaty and hot, and it's going to be real uncomfortable. And it's just like this other time when I went to this social occasion and this terrible thing happened, and the whole drama will play out in your head. And then you think, oh, that's the problem. And then maybe you have someone to talk to about that fantasy. Or maybe because now you have the fantasy in front of you and you looked at it, you can think, well, wait a minute. As you said, wait a second. It isn't like that other situation. My friends are here. I can go talk to John. I know him real well. We'll just have a conversation. I can go sit at a table and with one of my friends and spend most of the time there. I can be with my wife. But what'll happen is we get nervous and that fantasy will make itself manifest, but you don't want to face it, and that's when you rush to a premature solution. You shut it off. Right. Yeah, so what you're doing there is you're failing to allow the anxiety-ridden fantasy to make itself manifest. And you do that because you don't want to know where you're vulnerable. right? And no wonder, like who the hell wants to know where they're vulnerable? But the answer to that is, well, someone who wants to fix it. Because you're not going to fix it.
I do, yeah, I do, absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
And now I've come to, I love looking for those vulnerabilities, and I love a good community, and I love the discourse. I love my friends who will point them out and say, hey, here's a blind spot, which is why, again, circling back, it's why we have to have other people in our life. Now, if done in the right spirit, I love, that's the whole scientific process, right? Rejecting the no, like, I wasn't wrong, right? Like the whole idea is, let's be a little bit less wrong, right? So I think there's something
that's right.
beautiful.
That's the whole idea. That's humility, man, is to be a little bit less wrong. And Jesus, that's a big deal.
But what a fun way to live. It's such an easier way to live than I have to be right. That is an exhausting grip on your life. It's a choking grip on your life instead of, I want to be a little bit less wrong. And I begin to seek out places where I might be wrong. That's just taking the blade and trying to sharpen it as finely as possible.
I've been embroiled in a lot of conflict, and I really don't like conflict. And I think the reason that I've been embroiled in so much is because I won't delay it. Like if there's an issue at hand, I want to address it right now. And the reason for that isn't that I enjoy it. In fact, I don't enjoy it at all. But what I really don't enjoy is prolonged conflict that never goes anywhere and that never ends.
Yeah.
And so
conflict delayed is conflict amplified, right?
Exactly
It just grows on you. Yes.
Exactly that. And that's one of the oldest stories that people have been telling each other forever, is that ignored things grow in the darkness outside the city until they become monstrous and break down the walls. And so you think, well, I'm afraid of listening, I'm afraid of hearing the problems. And that's fair enough. It's no wonder you're afraid. But you're nowhere near afraid enough of not doing that, because that's a bloody catastrophe. That'll be a bomb that'll go off in 10 years and blow up your marriage. You'll find out that your wife had an affair because, well, for her own reasons and because you didn't pay any attention to her for like 15 years. And then you think, well, I was afraid to pay attention, and yeah, fair enough. But now look where you are. You're in hell, and that's just not an improvement. So, you know, there's problems of various size out there in the world. And the largest problems are the apocalyptic problems that you just described, right? And it isn't even obvious which of those apocalyptic problems are real. But we could say, well, there's always the possibility that large-scale systems will come to a precipitous collapse. And we have to live with that. That's true in our own lives. We could die at any moment. So could the people we love. Like our cultures can fall apart. The apocalyptic terror is always beckoning as a possibility. Okay, now the question is that your problem? Now the answer...
Can you do anything about it,
well,
right?
The answer is your own nervous system will tell you that. Because imagine you're facing a problem that's so big that it paralyzes you and it turns you into a tyrant. Okay, that's too big a problem for you, obviously. And what you have to do is you have to scale back the problem until you find a dragon that's a size that you're willing to contend with, that you'll actually contend with. And so, you know, maybe you shouldn't be addressing the large-scale political problems of the world because your own house is a bloody catastrophe. And you watch the news and it paralyzes you and turns you into a ranting tyrant, and that means you're not the man for that job. You have to scale back. And maybe if you scale back and practice straightening things up at the local level, which isn't trivial or easy, you get better and better at it, and then you could face larger and larger catastrophes and practically and productively, right? Instead of virtue signaling and going astray. You know, you do this in therapy. Is if someone is having a hard time making friends, you break that down into micro steps. And one thing you might have to do, as we discussed, is you might have to teach the person to introduce themselves. You know, and their problem is, I don't have any friends. It's like, no. Your problem is you don't know how to shake hands and look someone in the eye. Right? And then you might say, well, can you do that? And they might say, well, I'm afraid to shake hands. It's like, well, can you look at me? Can you stretch out your hand? You know, can you touch my hand? I mean, this might sound trivial, but lots of people are paralyzed with social anxiety. And they have no idea how to shake hands. Yeah. And that just stops them cold, right? Because if you can't introduce yourself, how the hell are you going to make friends? part of the reason that my lectures, I would say, have been successful to the degree that they have been is because people find them encouraging. And that actually seems to work, like it seems to be positive. Because it isn't necessarily
good news.
Well, it seems to be. I mean, it isn't necessarily the case that that would be the case, you know, because it could have been that I would have said encouraging things to people. There's more to you than meets the eye, and you're capable of more than you're demanding of yourself. And, you know, if you took on your responsibility and faced the things that you're trying to avoid, that your life would be richer and better and for you and for everyone around you. And the result of that could have been that thousands of people would come to me and say, you know, I gave that a pretty good shot, and your advice is really awful, and everything is, well, seriously, like, I took on that responsibility, it just bloody crushed me, and I'm way worse off than I was before, and everything's gone to hell around me, and like, thanks a lot, buddy. And that it's not like that's a completely incomprehensible possibility. But that doesn't seem to be what happens. Is what generally happens is that young people in particular, but not only, come to me and say, look, I've been trying to take on more responsibility and to face the things I've been avoiding, and everything is way better. It's like, okay, well, isn't that something?
Maybe onto something.
Well, then you ask yourself, well, what's the limit of that? Because that's the religious question, fundamentally, is, well, if you took on all the responsibility you could take on, and you faced everything that you needed to face, what would you be like? Who would you be? And how would the world transform around you? And, well, if the partial answer is, well, if I do that a little bit, things get a fair bit better, then the next question might be, well, what if you did that completely? And I don't think that's possible in some sense, right? It's like, you know, perfection is a horizon that always recedes, but it isn't obvious to me what the upper limit of that is, and certainly we do see people, I mean, saints, let's say.
What I was going to say. It's a Mother Teresa, it's a Francis of Assisi.
Who kind of push the limit, and miraculous things happen around them, maybe in the literal sense, and if not in the literal sense, close enough, you know, for all intents and purposes. And so that's heartening. I mean, I tear myself apart about this in many ways, because I think perhaps it's possible to take on too much responsibility and to crush yourself as a consequence. Maybe that's a sin of pride. Who knows? It's certainly possible. But my experience so far has been that when you see people bear their suffering nobly, there's nothing in that but good. That's something. And then when you see people take on more responsibility and decide that they're going to aim up and confront their suffering honestly and forthrightly, that their lives get better and the lives of people around them get better too. And so that's very strange as well, because it also means that the pathway to less suffering is through suffering, right? And that would be hopeful if the world was constituted that way. It's like, well, there's suffering. How do you make it worse? Run away. How do you make it better? Confront it. Yeah, but it's suffering. It's like, yeah, but it's there. There it is. It's right there. It's a precondition for existence or something like that. And it's like you have something important to do as well. And you confront it, and that's the pathway to transcending it. Probably. It's rough. Maybe we wish it would be different, and maybe we don't too. Israelites are wandering around in the desert, and what happens? Well, the same thing happened to them as is happening to us. They're worshiping false idols, and they're tempted. And it's no wonder they're tempted, because, well, they're in the desert. It's like it's not going so well. It's no wonder they're having a crisis of confidence, you know, and maybe they're pining for the old days, and they're not so sure that the God who informed them that being the subjects of tyranny was wrong, because now here we are in the desert. And so they lack faith. And it's understandable. But despite it being understandable, and this is one of the harsh things about the story, what does God do when he hears their complaints? He sends poisonous snakes in there to bite them. I think that's pretty brutal. You know, and that's the sort of thing that makes the technical atheist type sort of recoil about the conceptions of God in the Old Testament. It's like, it's not exactly what you'd expect in some sense from an all-merciful being. It's like you got these poor Israelites, First of all, they were in the tyranny. Then they had to go across the Red Sea. Now they've been wandering around in the desert, and that's not good. And so your best solution is to send a bunch of snakes in to bite them? But you think, well, you know, even if you're in the desert after a tyranny and you lose faith, then the snakes are going to bite you, right? Because that's what happens. Because if you're in, you know, a little analog of hell and you lose your faith, is that going to make it worse or better? And the answer is, well, I have reason to lose my faith. It's like, fair enough. That isn't the question. The question is, what happens if you lose it? Or you start looking for faith in the wrong directions? And the answer is, hell gets a little deeper. And it's one of the things that really frightened me. I spent a lot of time studying atrocity, and I realized on a metaphorical level that the reason hell is a bottomless pit is because no matter how bad it is, there is some bloody stupid thing you can do that will make it worse. And that's right, you know, and that's a terrifying realization to really understand that. And so, okay, poisonous snakes. And so now the Israelites are not only lost, but they're being bitten by venomous creatures. And you know, there's an echo of the snake in the Garden of Eden in that story. And so finally the Israelites, they get kind of tired of being bitten by the snakes. And they go to Moses and say, you want to have a chat with God because you seem to be in there fairly tight with him. How about you get him to call off the snakes and maybe we'll behave a little better. How's that for a deal? And Moses says, okay, I'll see what I can do. And he goes and has a chat with God, which is no trivial matter. And God doesn't do what you'd expect, because what you'd expect, like, and this would even work in terms of making it a comprehensible narrative, you'd think, okay, all right, guys, you've been bit enough, no more snakes. But that isn't what happens. And I think the reason that it doesn't happen is because there's no getting rid of the snakes. I think that's also why there's a snake in the Garden of Eden, is there's just no getting rid of the snakes. You have to learn to contend with them. It's more that. Or maybe it's better to learn to contend with snakes than it is to inhabit a world where there's no danger. Maybe it's something like that. I don't know. Anyways, God says something extremely surprising and very interesting from the perspective of a clinical psychologist. He tells Moses to cast snake in bronze and to raise it up on a staff. And the staff seems to me to be a reference to the staff of Moses. And that staff of Moses is something like the thing you put in the ground to orient yourself with. It's the staff of God too. It's sort of like an axiom. And maybe it's like the tree of life. It's like, here I stand. It's a center point. It's all of that. In any case, you put the snake up on the staff. That's also the symbol of healing, right? The physician symbol of healing, the staff with the snakes. And so it is a symbol of transformation, and partly that's because snakes shed their skin and are reborn, and so they're viewed as agents of transformation. And so that's all lurking in that symbol. And then God says, get the Israelites to go look at the snake on the staff, and then the poison won't poison them anymore. And I read that as a clinician. I thought, that's really interesting, because one of the things that we learned, all schools of psychotherapy learned in the last 100 years, is that if you get people to voluntarily confront what makes them afraid and what makes them want to avoid, then they get better. It's curative. And so that's the message there. It's like, well, if something is terrifying you, pay more attention to it. And that's actually what you teach people in psychotherapy. I mean, there's a variety of psychotherapeutic techniques, but exposure is probably the cardinal technique. It's like, if I can find out what you're avoiding and get you to confront it voluntarily, you'll get better. And the reason seems to be is that if you get people to confront what they're afraid of, and sometimes what disgusts them, but what they'd like to avoid, let's say, if you get them to confront it voluntarily, that could be the future even, you know, the indeterminate future, they don't get less afraid. They get braver. And that's different. It's not like they get accustomed to what they're looking at and they're no longer afraid. That kind of happens, but it isn't really what happens. What really happens is they discover there's a lot more to them than they thought. Not only do you have to move from point A to B in life, but point A is often a very difficult place to be. because we're fragile and bounded and mortal and limited, and because we know that. And so one of the implications of that, as many great religious traditions are at pains to illustrate or demonstrate or proclaim, is that life is essentially suffering. And I believe that to be a fundamental truth. But perhaps not the most fundamental truth, because I think the most fundamental truth is that despite the fact that life is suffering, people can transcend that. And partly the way they transcend that is by pursuing things of value. And so that if there is no value proposition at hand, then you have no meaning to justify the difficult conditions of your life. And that's brutally difficult for people. You know, Nietzsche said, he who has a why can bear any how. And you see, and I've certainly seen this as a clinical practitioner, that people who have no purpose in their life are embittered by the difficulties of their life. And they become first bitter, and then resentful, and then revengeful, and then cruel. And there's plenty of places to go past cruel. That's just where you start if you're really on a downhill path. You know, we kind of have this idea that, well, you're free as a child, and then you, let me see if I can put this properly, that you have a certain delightful, wonderful, positive freedom as a child, and then that's given up as you approach adulthood. But the truth of the matter is that you have a lot of potential as a child, but none of that is capable of manifesting itself as freedom before you become disciplined. And discipline is a matter of the imposition of order, and the order is necessary, especially for people who are hopeless and nihilistic. And lots of people are hopeless and nihilistic, way more people than you think. And part of that is because no one's ever really encouraged them. And so the book is in part a matter of encouragement. It's like, lay a disciplinary structure on yourself, get the chaos in check, and then you can move towards a state that's freer, because it's discipline first. Like, look, if you're going to become a concert pianist, there's going to be several thousand hours of extraordinarily disciplined practice. That's the imposition of order on your potential, let's say. But what comes out of that is a much grander freedom. And so in virtually every freedom that you have in life that's true freedom is purchased at the price of discipline. Before you can be a painter who can paint what's beyond mere memory, you have to inculcate that discipline skill, and a lot of that is painful repetition and hard grinding work. It's the sacrifice of the present for the future. But once you manage that, then things open up. And virtually everything you learn of value is like that's very, very, very difficult to learn to write. And there's arbitrary rules that you have to follow and bind yourself to. And while you're learning those rules, the probability that you have any creative freedom to speak of or any facility with the rules is very low. You're a rank beginner. And even to some degree, whatever creativity you have is going to have to be stifled while you're passing through that keyhole. But if you pass through it, then something massive opens up on the other side. And it is definitely the case that disciplinary institutions, universities, are exactly that, is they're places of guidance, and they're places to encourage people to develop the discipline that's necessary to see beyond the discipline. I mean, that's why we have disciplines, right? I mean, the words aren't there by accident. You have to narrow yourself first, and then you can broaden outward. And so that's part of the process of maturation. That's part of the sacrifice of childhood. Say, in childhood you're nothing but potential, but it's not realized and you don't know how to realize it. And so then the question is, well, how do you get to a point where you realize the potential? And the answer is, you sacrifice almost all of it to a single direction. This is Nietzsche's commentary on the Catholic Church. He's a great admirer of the Catholic Church, despite the fact that he was also a radical critic of Christianity. Said the thing about the Catholic Church is that it forced everything to be interpreted within a single explanatory framework. And that was a discipline. And once that discipline was established, then the disciplined mind could explode in every direction, which is precisely what happened. And so, and that's the thing about growing up, is that when you're a teenager and a young adult, you have to sacrifice everything you could have been as a child to be the one thing that you're aiming at. But then that opens up, and the universities are part and parcel of that process. And you need the guidance, because the library is too large to wander through it unaided. Many times in life, people don't get what they want and they need because they don't aim at it. And it's a hard lesson for people to learn, because they're cynical to begin with and they presume that there's no possible way of moving forward. But it's not so unreasonable to assume that you're not going to hit what you don't aim at, or you're not going to hit what you aim at and don't shoot at. And I've seen time and time again that if people do put forward a vision for what they regard as worthy of pursuit, which is something you have to determine in dialogue with yourself. It's like, given the difficult preconditions of existence, is there anything that you could conceive of that you would regard as sufficiently worthwhile so that you would be motivated to pursue it? It's a profound philosophical question, and it's not an unreasonable one. It's a good place to start. It's like, well, life is difficult enough to make you cynical and bitter, and perhaps enough to make you cynical and bitter and suicidal and homicidal and even genocidal. And it's not surprising in some sense. And then the question is, well, is there something that you can pursue that allows that to be acceptable or perhaps even desirable, which is something to do that justifies the suffering? And it's hard to say what that would be for each of you. It's something that you can discover. This is partly why Nietzsche was wrong. Nietzsche thought that after God had died, that human beings would have to invent their own values. But the psychoanalysts, I would say Jung foremost among them, put forward a very powerful counterclaim, which was that, well, you can't invent values. They're already built into you. You have to discover them. And I think that's true for each person. It's like, well, what would justify you in the abandonment of your resentment and hostility? What would be a sufficiently adventurous goal? You have to be humble and wise enough to understand that you might have to aim pretty damn low, especially in those places where you're not functioning well. And it might be so embarrassing that you can't bring yourself to fathom that that's actually who you are. But, Jung described the fool, the archetypal figure of the trickster and the fool, as the precursor to the savior, to the redeemer. And that's an unbelievable bit of wisdom, because what Jung meant was that to put yourself together, which is to follow the path of redemption, to follow the redeemer. If the redeemer is a type of personality that you could in fact be inhabited by or manifest, then the first steps towards that is to allow yourself to be a fool, right? It's because you don't know what you're doing. You have to admit that. And there's going to be a loss of ego or destruction of ego, arrogant ego that necessarily accompanies that. But you need the loss of that arrogant ego, because it's precisely what's interfering with your movement forward. It's part of the adversarial process, mythologically speaking, that stops moral progress. You're too proud of who you think you are to notice what you're like so that you could change properly. You don't want to sacrifice that part of yourself. It's probably associated with some delusion that helps you maintain, what would you say, a positive, although very fragile self-image, in the absence of genuine effort.
Challenge versus threat, it's not the same, even if the magnitude of the problem is the same. And so putting yourself in a challenging, let's call it mind frame, you can't just do that by magic. Putting yourself in a challenging mind frame is much easier on you psychophysiologically, because you don't go into the generalized stress response to the same degree. And you're activating your exploratory and seeking systems, which are dopaminergically mediated and that involve positive emotion. So if you can face something voluntarily rather than having it chase you, it's way better for you psychophysiologically. So that's partly why, it's worthwhile to go find the dragon in its lair instead of waiting for it to come and eat you. So, and especially when you also add the idea that if you go find the dragon in its lair, you might find it when it's a baby instead of a full-fledged bloody monster that is definitely going to take you down. And so that's part of the reason why, there's a whole bunch of things that that emerge out of that observation, like don't avoid small problems that you know are there. Face them, because they'll grow into big problems all by themselves. And you can think about, imagine the tax department sends you a notification. You owe them like $300. Well, it's that's annoying. Maybe you don't even want to open the letter. Or maybe if you do, you just put it on the shelf. But that damn thing doesn't just sit there like a piece of paper on the shelf, right? You ignore that for 5 or 6 years, it's going to become attached to all sorts of horrible things. And if you ignore it long enough, you get the idea. It's going to turn into something that is completely unlike the little piece of paper that it's written on. And many, many problems in life are like that. You'll see that they pop their ugly little head up, and and you might want to turn away. You might not want to think about it, which is the easiest way of turning away, right? You just don't attend to it. It's not like you repress it or anything like that. You just fail to attend to it. And that's as a long-term strategy, it's dismal. It's also something I think that's more characteristic of people who are high in neuroticism and high in agreeableness, because agreeable people don't like conflict. And people who are high in neuroticism, who are high in negative emotion, are hit harder per unit of uncertainty or threat. And so, and that's partly why in psychotherapy, a lot of times the people you see need assertiveness training, so that would be the opposite of agreeableness, or they need to help get their anxiety and emotional pain under control. Those are not the only reasons. There's antisocial behavior, but you can't fix that in therapy in all likelihood. There's alcoholism. There's lots and lots of other reasons, but those are two major reasons. I bought this cottage up north in northern Canada, and it's very dark up there. And you can go onto the dock at night, and it's dark enough so you can see the Milky Way, and it has to be pretty dark before you can see the Milky Way. And it's very impressive. You know what that's like if you've been out to see the night sky, or maybe you feel the same way when you see the Grand Canyon, or a remarkable waterfall, or some particularly beautiful scene, or perhaps you feel that way in a cathedral, or more likely you feel that way when you're listening to music that really grips you, right? And it's all the same experience, it's an experience of awe, and it's way down low in your nervous system like the orienting reflex. It's not a cognitive response precisely. It's a precognitive emotional response that signifies significance. And you look up at the night sky, and it fills you with a sense of awe. But it doesn't just do that. You see, it activates the impulse to imitate, which is a very deep motivation in human beings. We're unbelievable mimics. We mimic each other all the time, which is why we all use the same words, let's say. We're very good at embodying other people's embodiments. It's a particular talent that human beings have, and we're so good at that we imitate all sorts of things that aren't even human. And so then you view this expansive night sky, and a sense of awe fills you as you confront the infinite. And it calls to something inside of you that can master the infinite. And that's a form of imitation, right? To look into the darkest place, the most wide expanse possible, and to have something inside you respond that's capable of dealing with that. That's that instinct to imitate. And that's calling the best out of you, and that's why you love doing that. And it isn't just that you love it, it's that you cannot live without it. You cannot live without it. And I know so many of you, atheist or otherwise, you can't live without music. You think, well, why can you not live without music? And what is it calling to precisely? That remarkable interplay of harmonious patterns, because that's what music is, and that's what the world is. It's not objects, it's the harmonious interplay of patterns, and music reflects that, and then you orient yourself in your embodied manner to those patterns and dance along with the world. And that revivifies you, and if you're particularly good at, well, maybe you'll also attract a mate. And you want a mate that doesn't attempt to dominate you sexually during the introductory dance, right? You want a mate who will play along with you and match your movements to theirs, so that you can see that there's a harmonious interplay between the two of you as you meet in play, soul to soul, if you can manage it. And everyone knows that. And that capacity that's called out in the dance is the same capacity that's called out by the night sky, and it's the same thing that's represented in those Byzantine churches. You look deep enough into infinity and you find your destiny. And that destiny is everything you could be. And we all know that and this is what men and women search for in each other. You know, if you're rejected by a woman, well, why is she rejecting you? Well, maybe her judgment is off, and that would be very, convenient for you. But she's rejecting you because you are not all that you could be, and maybe not even all that you need to be. And so that's a very painful rejection, and it causes all sorts of tension between men and women. But, you know, women have a lot at stake in this game. And so they're looking for something, what? Powerful, dominating, brutal, terrible? No. Something perhaps capable of that. But even more important, capable of mastering it, right? And capable of singing despite that. We all know that's true, and the shame that men feel when they're rejected by women is precisely the shame that they feel at knowing deep in their heart that they have not lived up to what they are capable of being. And that harsh judgment that women lay on men, which, by the way, is part of our sexual evolution, because we were shaped by sexual selection, which, by the way, is the operation of consciousness on the structures of matter at the most basic possible level. Well, it's a terrible rejection, but it's a salutary rejection. And that process of differentiated choice has shaped us into what we are. That action of consciousness, wanting the best from a potential partner and selecting, at least in part, on that basis. And men participate in that too, in the Meistersinger manner. You know, men aren't competing for dominance with each other constantly in a zero-sum game to achieve sexual dominance. There's an element of that, right? Because some things are a zero-sum game, but men are perfectly capable and more than willing, in fact, to aggregate themselves into skilled groups and to celebrate the elevation of the most skilled above all else. And so we see this cooperative venture between men and women over the longest run of possible time in producing some refinement of the human spirit in embodied form. And we want that from everyone. We require that from everyone. We're thrilled to the core of our soul when we encounter it in a conversation or in a course or in a work of art that calls to us in that manner. We need to know this increasingly. We need to know all this consciously. You know, we've acted it out. We've produced images to represent it. It tugs at our heartstrings. It manifests itself in our dreams and our works of art, our literary works. It's all lurking there in some sense, and it's not the satanic power of corrupt oppression, not fundamentally. That's a far weaker force than that which can overcome it. And everything around us would be nothing but hell if that's all there was. And everything around us is not only hell. You know, for fragile and broken creatures, ignorant to the core, we don't do too badly. And people are capable of a nobility, especially under the duress of suffering, that's virtually miraculous when you encounter it. And it's so heartening to see that, and you've seen it in the people that you love when they're going through terrible trials. You know, people become corrupted and embittered by their catastrophes, and it's no wonder. But certainly in the main, that's not the fundamental human response. The fundamental human response is keep calm and carry on, you know, and good on you for that. And so, well, to sum up, let's say, we solve the power of perception with the divine word. That's how it is. And what does that mean? Well, it means truth. Every word a prayer, right? Every word a groping to find a firm foundation to stand on while you make your way through life. And every time you hear a conversation of that sort, or hear yourself participating in that prayerful process, orienting yourself to this highest uniting good and using that to govern your utterance, it's balm for the soul. Yeah, it's love that guides that, and love is the desire to work for the betterment of all things. And that's the proper orienting response, we could say. And it's truth nested inside of that. And that's how it is. And that's how it should be. And that's how it may forever be.
ask and it shall be given you, seek and ye shall find, knock and it shall be opened unto you. For everyone that asketh receiveth, and he that seeketh findeth, and to him that knocketh it shall be opened. That sounded pretty optimistic again, but again, I think it's a description of the structure of existential reality, and by which I mean, when I'm in my clinical practice and I observe, and this is also the case with my students, is let's say, people's lives aren't what they would like them to be. And so then you ask, why? Well, forget about tragedy and catastrophe, because that's self-evident, and we're not going to discuss that. Although the degree to which you bring about your own tragedy is always indeterminate. But I would never say that every terrible thing that is visited on a person is something they deserved. I think that that's a very dangerous presupposition, especially because everyone gets sick and everyone dies. But one of the main reasons that people don't get what they want is because they don't actually figure out what it is. And the probability that you're going to get what would be good for you, let's say, which would even be better than what you want, right? Because, you might be wrong about what you want easily. But maybe you could get what would really be good for you. Well, why don't you? Well, because you don't try. You don't think, okay, here's what I would like if I could have it. And I don't mean in a way that you manipulate the world to force it to deliver you goods for status or something like that. That isn't what I mean. I mean something like, imagine that you were taking care of yourself like you were someone you actually cared for. And then you thought, okay, I'm caring for this person. I would like things to go as well for them as possible. What would their life have to be like in order for that to be the case? Well, people don't do that. They don't sit down and think, all right, let's figure it out. You've got a life. It's hard, obviously. It's like 3 years from now, you can have what you need. You've got to be careful about it. You can't have everything. You can have what would be good for you, but you have to figure out what it is, and then you have to aim at it. Well, my experience with people has been if they figure out what it is that would be good for them, and then they aim at it, then they get it. And it's strange because they don't it's a strange thing. It's not quite that simple because, you may formulate an idea about what would be good for you, and then you take 10 steps towards that, and you find out that your formulation was a bit off, and so you have to reformulate your goal. So you're kind of going like this as you move towards the goal. But a huge part of the reason that people fail is because they don't ever set up the criteria for success. And so, since success is a very narrow line and very unlikely, the probability that you're going to stumble on it randomly is 0. And so there's a proposition here, and the proposition is, if you actually want something, you can have it. Now the question then would be, well, what do you mean by actually want? And the answer is that you reorient your life in every possible way to make the probability that that will occur as certain as possible. And that's a sacrificial idea, right? It's like, you don't get everything. Obviously. But maybe you can have what you need. And maybe all you have to do to get it is ask. But asking isn't a whim or today's wish. It's like, you have to be deadly serious about it. You have to think, okay, like I'm taking stock of myself. And if I was going to live properly in the world and I was going to set myself up such that being would justify itself in my estimation, and I don't mean as a harsh judge, exactly what is it that I would aim at? What I learned to do, I think, was to stop saying things that made me weak. And now I'm still trying to do that because I'm always feeling when I talk whether or not the words that I'm saying are either making me align or making me come apart. And I think the alignment, I really do think the alignment I think alignment is the right way of conceptualizing it, because I think if you say things that are as true as you can say them, let's say, then they come out of the depths inside of you.
Because we don't know where thoughts come from. We don't know how far down into your substructure the thoughts emerge. We don't know what processes of physiological alignment are necessary for you to speak from the core of your being. We don't understand any of that. We don't even conceptualize that, but I believe that you can feel that. And I learned some of that from reading Carl Rogers, by the way, who's a great clinician, because he talked about mental health in part as a coherence between the spiritual or the abstract and the physical, that the two things were aligned. And there's a lot of idea of alignment in psychoanalytic and clinical thinking. But anyways, I decided that I would start practicing not saying things that would make me weak. And what happened was that I had to stop saying almost everything that I was saying. I would say 95% of it. It's a hell of a shock to wake up and I mean, this was over a few months, but it's a hell of a shock to wake up and realize that you're mostly dead wood. It's a shock, you know, and you might think, well, do you really want all of that to burn off? It's like, well, there's nothing left but a little husk, 5% of you. It's like, well, if that 5% is solid, then maybe that's exactly what you want to have happen. Well, so I told you that story as an elaboration of this line. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. It's a question worth asking. Just exactly what are your motives? Well, you know, maybe they're purer than mine were, and it's certainly possible. I don't think that I'm naturally a particularly good person. I think I have to work at it very, very hard. And I don't necessarily think that everyone is like that. But some people are worse than that, and everyone's like that to some degree. So it's worth thinking about. Just how much trouble are you trying to cause? You know, and the other thing you might think about is that if you're not doing something important with your life, by your own definition, because that's the game that we're playing, you get to define the terms, at least initially, maybe you're prone to cause trouble just because you don't have anything better to do. Because at least trouble is more interesting than boring. You know, that's something you learn if you read Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky knew that extraordinarily well. And so if you're not doing something, if you're not pushing yourself to the limits of your capacity, then you have plenty of leftover, what would you say, willpower, energy, and resources to devote to causing interesting trouble. And so, also I would say this is also an archetypal scenario. God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. That's something to meditate on. And it's not self-destructive, because what it is an attempt to, it's like the diagnosis of an illness. It's like if that does happen to be the case for you, or to some degree, maybe it's only 10% of you or something, or maybe it's 90%, well then coming to terms with that is excellent, because then maybe you can stop doing it. And what would be the downside to that? You'd have to give up your resentment, obviously, and your hatred and all of that, and that's really annoying, because those emotions are they're easy to engage in, and they're engaging, and they have this feeling of self-righteousness with them, and that goes along with them. But you're not doing this in order to put yourself down. You're doing this in order to separate the wheat from the chaff, and to leave everything that you don't have to be behind. Sit on your bed one day and ask yourself, what remarkably stupid things am I doing on a regular basis to absolutely screw up my life? And if you actually ask that question, but you have to want to know the answer, right? Because that's actually what asking the question means. It doesn't mean just mouthing the words. It means you have to decide that you want to know. You'll figure that's out so fast it'll make your hair curl. It's as if Jung thought about this. He thought that people had two poles of consciousness, and one was the individual consciousness that we each identify with, and the other was something he called the self, and the self is you might think about it as the divine within. That's close enough approximation. It's the universal part of your consciousness. It's your conscience. That's another way of thinking about it, whatever your conscience is. But it's something that you can consult. It's like the Socratic daemon. Socrates said that the thing that made him different than everyone else in Greece was that he consulted his daemon, his genius. He asked himself how it was that he should conduct himself in the world, and then he did that, whatever it was. He didn't try to force a solution, he didn't try to force a solution selfishly. He asked, I'm going to manifest myself in the best possible manner in the world. I would like to do that.
what would that be? Part of spiritual development is to recognize the satanic tendencies that characterize you and to fully wrestle with them and to integrate them. That's the thing. It's not so much to cast them away, it's to transmute them. You know, and you can see the difference between people who've done that and people who haven't, at least to some degree, because people who haven't integrated the shadow at all are naive. And you can tell that when you look at them, and you can tell that when you talk to them. And because they're naive, they're often resentful as well because they get taken advantage of. And someone who's integrated that more, they're dangerous in the martial arts sort of way, which is they're dangerous, but they don't have to use it because their presence radiates, what would you say? It doesn't radiate threat exactly. Well, certainly strength, but it's the potential for havoc. That's the right way of thinking about it. There's an implicit potential for havoc, and that's really necessary. It's one of the things that gives people self-respect. This is an interesting thing about the integration of the shadow, because recognizing yourself as the locus of evil, let's say, actually, in some sense, gives you far more respect for yourself, strangely enough, because the same respect that you might have for a wild animal or even a monster. It's like, so then maybe you learn to treat yourself differently. Like, I think this is particularly true with regards to the discipline of children. You know, if you know that you're a monster and that will manifest itself in your life, consciously or unconsciously, and if it's unconsciously, it's not good, then you become better at disciplining children. And the reason for that is that you don't want to expose them to your dark side. And so if they behave and don't provoke you, which means they'll also behave for other people, then the monstrous part can stay in abeyance, and then that's great. But if you don't understand yourself as capable of wreaking havoc, and that can be the kind of havoc that unfolds over decades, right? Because if you're going to abuse a child, it's the primitive form of abuse is the physical abuse. The sophisticated form of abuse is the continual undermining of the child's courage across perhaps their entire life. And there's a terribly monstrous element to that. And if you're not respected properly by the child, say, you will absolutely take revenge on them. And, you know, that's the whole, in some sense, that's the whole Freudian psychoanalytic story. It's not all of it, but it's a huge part of it. So
interesting that you say that you have to accept the fact that you're dangerous or become dangerous, because I'd also say that if you haven't done that kind of shadow work, if you haven't made friends with your anger, if you haven't integrated it, you're actually more dangerous.
Yes, definitely.
Because then things will happen it will come out in a way that you don't expect.
Right, it comes out disintegrated. So it comes out as an autonomous spirit, right, under no one's control, and that's like a burst of rage, let's say. You know, when you hear about a mother who's done something terrible to one of her children, that's the reason, is that, you know, maybe she's just been laid off, maybe she went out and had too much to drink, maybe she's hungover, you know, she's angry and lonesome, and she's overwhelmed by the responsibility of the children, and she has a child who's testing, and she doesn't know how to limit it. And one day, the child tests at exactly the wrong time, and it's like mayhem. And everybody goes, well, what happened? It's like, well, 7 terrible things came together at the same time and produced this outburst of disintegrated rage. And like, look the hell out when that happens, you know? So, yeah, you want to have that. You either have that or it has you. Those are the options. And you don't become safe by being castrated.
Well, what you want to do is face the dragon and get the damn gold. That's what you want to do. Well, you have to be a paradoxical being even to do that. So, you know, in The Hobbit, it's Bilbo in The Hobbit, you know, he's kind of this little underdeveloped, overprotected shire dweller, and he's called on a great adventure to go and find the dragon, and he has to become a thief in order to manage it. Well, that's pretty weird, you know. It's like, well, it's because as a good citizen, he's just not enough to conquer a dragon. He has to also become a bad citizen in some sense. He has to incorporate the part of himself that's monstrous, let's say, and develop that and hone it. And that's to say that, well, if you're harmless, you're not virtuous. You're just harmless. You're like a rabbit. A rabbit isn't virtuous. It just can't do anything except get eaten. It's not virtuous. If you're a monster and you don't act monstrously, then you're virtuous. But you also have to be a monster. Well, you see this all the time. Harry Potter's like that too. It's like he's flawed, he's hurt, he's got evil in him. He can talk to snakes, man. He breaks rules all the time. All the time. He's not obedient at all. But you know, he has a good reason for breaking the rules. And if he couldn't break the rules, him and his little clique of rule-breaking, you know, troublemakers, if they didn't break the rules, they wouldn't attain the highest goal. So it's very peculiar, but it's a very, very common mythological notion. You know, the hero has to be a monster, but a controlled monster. Batman is like that, you know. I mean, it's everywhere. It's the story you always hear. One question is, you know, you're kind of implicitly moral insofar as you're socialized. But that's sort of procedural, it's just built into you. This is different. This is also becoming conscious of it and expanding out your personality into dimensions that it wouldn't normally occupy. So this happens to people all the time. So, for example, lots of my clients, my clinical clients, are too agreeable. And they're generally women, because women are more agreeable than men, but not always, because I've had agreeable men as clients as well. And what happens is they're resentful and they don't know how to stand up for themselves, and it's because they're very compassionate by nature. And so if you're entering into a negotiation with them, they'll let you win. Well, that's not so good, because you know you need to win too, especially if you're in an organization of adults where there's a struggle, right? When you have kids, you can let them win, especially infants. You have to let them win, and that's partly why compassion is so necessary. But as a basis for negotiation between adults, it's like, sorry, it's insufficient. You have to be a bit of a monster so that you can say no. And so a lot of what you do in psychotherapy is treat people's anxiety and depression. That's a huge chunk of it. Help them straighten out the way they think. That's a huge chunk of it. But another chunk of it is, well, let's toughen you up. You know, let's put you in a position where you can bargain. Let's teach you how to assert yourself and stand up for yourself, and that's assertiveness training, and it's a huge chunk of psychotherapy. And you need to learn it. It's like, because part of how you regulate your interactions with other people is to negotiate. And you cannot negotiate unless you can say no. You can't do it. And it causes conflict to say no, and if you don't like conflict, which is basically the definition of being agreeable, then you can't tolerate the conflict, and so then you can't negotiate on your own behalf, and so then you keep losing, and you're bullied, and you know, it's not good. Then you get resentful, and it's really not good. So you have to develop your inner monster a little bit, and then that makes you a better person, not a worse person. It's weird, but that's just how it is. So the question is, why do people pursue rewards that don't produce this resonance? They don't have a value hierarchy. So Pleasure Island, it's a good example. Those kids that were brought there were lost. So they didn't have anywhere to go. They didn't have an identity. So they default to local pleasure. And that's better than none. Although the problem with local pleasure, well, as the narrative made clear, is that you better look out if you're impulsive, because it's going to kick back on you hard. And the reason is, you're only considering the immediate time frame. And the problem is that things propagate across all the time frames. And so just because something works really well this second, cocaine, for example, doesn't mean that it's a tenable solution to the class of all problems. So usually, often, people pursue
local pleasure because that's the best they can imagine, it's the best they've been taught, they don't see another alternative. So it could be ignorance, it can be they don't want to adopt the responsibility, because part of the problem with working at every level of the hierarchy simultaneously is that it's like dancing to a very complex waltz, let's say. You have to be paying attention to a very large number of things simultaneously and doing things right. It requires responsibility. And so, you know, it's a pain, it's a weight. Part of the reason people drink alcohol is to get rid of their responsibility. I mean, that's, you know, you hear people drink because they have problems. It's like, yeah, no. Some people drink because they're anxious, and alcoholics drink because they're in withdrawal. But young people drink because they're sick and tired of being responsible, because it's annoying. It's like, so I'll drink enough, I won't care about the medium to long-term consequences, because alcohol, that's exactly what alcohol does. It doesn't make you ignorant of the medium to long-term consequences, but it makes you not care about them. And partly it's because it dampens anxiety. So it dampens anxiety, leaves your positive emotion circuits intact, so then you can go out there and do stupid fun things, and that's a party, really. Let's go do stupid fun things. That's a party. But the medium to long-term consequences it's risky. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but it's risky. So, yeah, they don't know better. That's the answer, I would say. To navigate, there's two things you need to know. And the first is, where the hell are you? Exactly, precisely, right? Razor sharp. What's good about you and what's bad about you? By your own reckoning. You don't have to, you can ask other people, but this is a game you play yourself. It's like, as far as I'm concerned, I'm taking stock. What is it that's okay about me and what needs some work? And you got to watch to not be too self-critical when you're doing that too, because that can just be another kind of flaw. And then the next is, okay, well, where are you going? What's your destination? Well, and that's what the frame is. Now, you know, you could do that in a very sophisticated way. And you do that by thinking consciously about who it is that you are in an articulated manner, and where you want to go and why and how you're going to get there. And people hardly ever do that. That's come as such an absolute shock to me as an educator. I just, because one of the other programs, I use this in my classes. One of the other programs in this suite of programs is called the Future Authoring Program, and I started developing it in my Maps of Meaning class, which is where some of this material is from. And I got students to write about their past. It's like, okay, we're talking about stories, so let's tell your story. Who are you? How did you get here? And what are you now? That usually helps people put things to rest, although it's quite stressful while you're doing it. Stress goes up when you're doing it, and maybe you feel miserable for a couple of weeks, and then stress goes down and it stays down. So that's also why people don't do it, because who the hell wants to have their stress go up? But if it's temporary, it's a sacrifice. So then the next issue is, well, where are you going? And one of the things that, and this I cannot understand, these students that have been in education system for 15 years, 14 years, high-end students, most of them, not once in their whole bloody life did anyone ever get them to sit down for like a day and say, all right, justify your existence. Like, well, seriously, it's like, here you are in university, you're taking a bunch of courses, you've got some sort of vague career plan. It's like, defend the damn thing a bit, since you're going to go live it and everything. You're staking everything on it. It's like, what's your damn plan? And why are you so convinced that it's not the plan of a babbling fool? Because if you haven't thought about it, then it is. And if you really want to go out there and live that out, you know, one of the things Carl Jung said was that you're in a story, whether you know it or not. And then he made two nice comments about that. If it's someone else's story, you're probably going to get a bit part, and it might not be the one you want. And if it's a story that you don't know, it might be one with a really bad ending. Or maybe it's just bad, period, with a worse ending. And if you don't know what the story that you're living out is, maybe that's the one. You know, maybe you got that from your mother, you got it from your grandmother, you got it from your aunt, or God only knows where you picked it up, because you pick up things like mad, because that's what human beings are like. So maybe you're living a malevolent tragedy unconsciously.
And then one thing you might ask yourself is, well, how wretched and miserable is your life? Let's add futile to that. How wretched, miserable, and futile is your life? And you might say, well, yeah, 70% on each count. It's like, then you're probably unconsciously living out a malevolent tragedy. And maybe that's not for the best. Oh, it's either that or the whole universe hates you. Getting away plus getting forward are separate motivational systems, and if you can add them together, it's real potent. And part of the reason why in the future authoring exercise that you guys are going to do as the class progresses, you're asked to outline the place you'd like to end up, which is your desired future, and also the place that you could end up if you let everything fall apart, is so that your anxiety chases you and your approach systems pull you forward. You're maximally motivated then. And it's important because otherwise you can be afraid of pursuing the things that you want to pursue, right? And that's very common. And so then the fear inhibits you as the promise pulls you forward, but it makes you weak because you're afraid. You want to get your fear behind you, pushing you. And so what you want to be is more afraid of not pursuing your goals than you are of pursuing them. It's very, very helpful. And lots of times in life, and this is something really worth knowing, you know, and this is one of the advantages to being an autonomous adult, is you don't get to pick the best thing. You get to pick your poison. You have two bad choices and you get to pick which one you're willing to suffer through. And every choice has a bit of that element in it. And so if you know that, it's really freeing, because otherwise you torture yourself by thinking, well, maybe there's a good solution to this, you know, compared to the bad solution. It's like, no, sometimes there's just risky solution 1 and risky solution 2. And sometimes both of them are really bad, but you at least get to pick which one you're willing to suffer through. And that actually makes quite a bit of difference, because you're also facing it voluntarily then, instead of it chasing you. And that is an entirely different psychophysiological response. Challenge versus threat, it's not the same, even if the magnitude of the problem is the same. And so putting yourself in a challenging, let's call it mind frame, you can't just do that by magic. Putting yourself in a challenging mind frame is much easier on you psychophysiologically, because you don't go into the generalized stress response to the same degree. And you're activating your exploratory and seeking systems, which are dopaminergically mediated and that involve positive emotion. So if you can face something voluntarily rather than having it chase you, it's way better for you psychophysiologically. So that's partly why, well, it's worthwhile to go find the dragon in its lair instead of waiting for it to come and eat you. So, and especially when you also add the idea that if you go find the dragon in its lair, you might find it when it's a baby instead of a full-fledged bloody monster that is definitely going to take you down. And so that's part of the reason why, well, there's a whole bunch of things that emerge out of that observation, like don't avoid small problems that you know are there. Face them, because they'll grow into big problems all by themselves. And you can think about, imagine the tax department sends you a notification. You owe them like $300. Well, it's you know, that's annoying. Maybe you don't even want to open the letter. Or maybe if you do, you just put it on the shelf. But that damn thing doesn't just sit there like a piece of paper on the shelf, right? You ignore that for 5 or 6 years, it's going to become attached to all sorts of horrible things. And if you ignore it long enough, you get the idea. It's going to turn into something that is completely unlike the little piece of paper that it's written on. And many, many problems in life are like that. You'll see that they pop their ugly little head up, and you know, and you might want to turn away. You might not want to think about it, which is the easiest way of turning away, right? You just don't attend to it. It's not like you repress it or anything like that. You just fail to attend to it. And that's as a long-term strategy, it's dismal. So anyways, you know, we got students to start writing in detail about not what they wanted. It's not a career thing, because that's the closest people usually get, is they have a career plan. It's like, no, it's not a career plan. That's peripheral. Important, but peripheral. It's like, all right, you got 3 years, man. You're going to live them anyways. Devote those 3 years to setting the world up around you so that it's the best it could possibly be for you, as if you were taking care of yourself, as if you cared for yourself. Well, what would that look like? You know, let's say, just for the sake of argument, if you figured out where you were, that you could have what would be best for you. Well, what is that? I bet you never asked. People don't ask. And so life comes at them like random snakes, and they sort of fend them off. And life goes by, and things don't work out the way people expected them to. But a huge part of that is they didn't know where they were because they wouldn't look or didn't know that they should look. Ignorance and willful blindness, right? Two great catastrophes. And they never figured out where they wanted to go or why. Now, there's a problem with figuring out where you want to go. And the problem is that you make your conditions for failure clear to yourself. And people don't like that. So if you keep yourself in the fog, then you can't tell when you screwed up. Now, that isn't so good because you're still screwing up. You're just too blind, self-blind to notice. Although in the short term, that's less painful. If you make your criteria for success razor sharp, then you know every time you screw up. But that's great because then you could fix it. You could either repair the behavioral inadequacy or the conceptual inadequacy that you're using as a tool in that situation, or maybe you could adjust your damn plan. Either way, you can fix it. And so, okay, so you're living in one of these bloody things, and you might as well, it seems to me, you might as well make it the best one you could live in because you don't have anything better to do. Now, if you don't do that, if you don't do it consciously, and this is what the psychoanalysts pointed out, is that you have innumerable quasi-autonomous subsystems that make you up that will generate stories impulsively, and you'll just act them out. And you know that because you watch yourself over 2 weeks and you think, Jesus, I did a lot of stupid things in the last 2 weeks. And you think, why? And it's because you're a collection of somewhat random quasi-autonomous personality units, and lacking a leader, they're just going to fire off whenever they want. You know, first you're hungry, then you're thirsty, then you want to go to bed with your wife, you know, then you want to sleep in, then you want to tell your boss off, then you want to curse at the guy that cuts you off in traffic. It's like, you're kind of like a 2-year-old, you know, just it's one emotional frame after another vying for dominance. There's no overarching hierarchy, and there's no king at the top. Okay, so you don't see irrelevant things. That's most things. You do see things that move you forward, and you do see things that get in your way. And in the class of things that get in your way are indeterminate occurrences, novel or anomalous occurrences. And almost everything that gets in your way is in some sense a novel occurrence, because you usually structure your behavior so that you don't go anywhere where something wildly anomalous is likely to occur. So if you encountered an obstacle, two things happen at the same time, and one is that your movement forward to your specific goal or sets of goals is blocked. But the second thing that happens is you're faced with a mystery, and the mystery is this thing wasn't supposed to exist, but it does exist. So what implication does that have for everything I think? And that's very, very hard on people. They do not like that at all, and no wonder, because it's the constrained chaos that's underneath everything, inhibited by your contextual knowledge, that suddenly popped its head up into your world. It's like the shark in the movie Jaws, which is of course a mythological story. It's exactly that, and it's exactly what that movie signified. A safe vacation paradise, all of a sudden threatened by some subterranean thing that can pull you down, and that destroys the peace and the harmony of that particular community. It's a dragon story, it's a hero myth, it's the story that people have been telling forever. So and what you can think of that thing that reemerges, that shark that rises up from the depths, or that whale, or that dragon, or that predator, or the foreign invader for that matter, or the barbarian. They all fit into the same category. That's what had been deemed irrelevant suddenly manifesting itself. And when you think about how much is deemed irrelevant, the fact that it suddenly manifests itself, that's exactly the purpose for the reason for the trauma. It's like, Well, I've eradicated from my conceptualizations 99.99% of everything. It's zeroed out. And all of a sudden I've made a mistake. Bang, I don't know where I am. Well, what's relevant when you don't know where you are? And the answer to that is, since you don't know, everything is relevant. And you can imagine the sort of terror that people who experience paranoid schizophrenia are living in perennially, because what happens to them is precisely that. They undergo neurophysiological transformations that makes everything that they once depended on disappear, and everything comes back as relevant. And that puts them in the early stages of schizophrenia. That's extraordinarily stressful neurophysiologically. So they're overwhelmed with cortisol, and their brains deteriorate as a consequence of that. It's just too much. So, and unsurprisingly, right, because you can hardly deal with anything, let alone with everything. Now, and often what you see, and it's rarely conceptualized this way in the training of clinical therapists, but often what you see when you are dealing with people who are in crisis isn't people who have a mental illness. In fact, in my experience, that's actually quite rare. What's far more common is that the person that you're talking to has become overwhelmed by catastrophe. So their life has fallen apart in some way that makes what they're doing actually impossible. You know, so maybe someone very close to them in their family that they were depending on has developed a very serious illness, and that's thrown their entire financial state into utter chaos. Or maybe they've developed a condition that makes it impossible for them to work. Or, you know, you can imagine the potential range of catastrophes. And they're coming to see you because they're anxious and depressed, but the reason they're anxious and depressed is because everything they have ignored has popped its head back up and is hell-bent on their destruction. And often you see people who are being attacked by 5 or 6 of these monsters at the same time. And it isn't their mental illness that stops them from being able to deal with it, although that, you know, whatever weaknesses you have are going to interfere. It's the fact that what they're facing is no damn joke, and if you were facing it, you'd feel exactly the same way. So then you're trying to come up with practical solutions to these tremendously complex problems. And that's well, it's extraordinarily difficult, generally speaking. People often don't come to a therapist until they've exhausted their entire range of resources. They cannot figure out what to do. And so, you know, in a situation like that, you can administer antidepressants, and maybe that'll help the person increase their stress resistance. But and it may be that because they're depressed and have been brought down, that they are in fact exaggerating the danger of some of the smaller monsters that are after them. But making the person more stress resilient doesn't give them, for example, a new job, and it certainly doesn't bring back the person they've been living with for 2 years who has a degenerating neurological disease or some form of cancer. Like, these things are major. You know, I often see people who, well, they're in a relationship, maybe they're rather isolated, older people. One of the partners is dying and their entire financial situation has become catastrophic. It's like, that's not a mental illness, man. I mean, they may have got into that situation because of one inadequacy or another, but you don't even want to push that too far, because that sort of thing can happen to anyone, and will in fact happen to most people in one form or another, at least at some point in their lives. So you want to be damn prepared for that. You want to be prepared for that, because it's bitter and harsh and anxiety provoking and painful. But if you're not ready, then it's also hell. And often you can stop things from becoming hell, even though you can't stop them from being bitter and painful and anxiety provoking and all of that. You can at least delimit the catastrophe enough so that it doesn't permanently bring you and the people around you down. And that's not so bad, right? That's a hell, or at least it's a lot better than the alternative. So this is the problem, you know, things object, things are obstacles. Well, how big is the obstacle? It's the same question as how big is the predator that's lurking outside the door of our cave. It's exactly the same problem, except conceptualized abstractly, and I would say exactly the same systems that your distant ancestors used to conceptualize the lurking predator are the systems that are activated now when you encounter the re-emergence of all the monsters that you've ignored. It's the same neurological platform. You think, well, how could it be otherwise? Because evolution is a conservative process. Everything about you is built on ancient foundations, right? Very little new certainly very little radically new comes into existence. It's mostly tinkering with structures that have been around forever, like your body plan, for example. That's unbelievably old. I mean, you share that with lizards, roughly speaking, so it's incredibly ancient. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. That's an interesting line, because if you remember back in the story of Adam and Eve, what happens to Adam once he eats the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and wakes up, the scales fall from his eyes, becomes self-conscious, develops the knowledge of good and evil, is he won't walk with God when God calls him in the garden. And so Noah is Adam without the fall, essentially. And there's something that Noah's doing right that motivates God to spare him, or maybe to show him a pathway through the emergent chaos, something like that. And that's worth thinking about a lot, because there will be situations in your life where what you face is the emergent chaos. And maybe that'll be some terrible catastrophe inside your family, or maybe it'll be something that's occurring on a much broader social level. But the chaos is coming. And what you're going to want to know, unless you want to be a denizen of the chaos or even a contributor to it, and perhaps that is what you want, because many people under those circumstances choose that. What you want is to know how you build an ark and get through it. That's what if you're interested in life, if you're interested in proper being, and you're disinclined to produce any more suffering than necessary, then you want to know how to conduct yourself when the catastrophe comes, so that you have a reasonable possibility of moving through it and starting anew. So when this old story says, well, God's not happy and he's going to wipe everything out, it's like, well, you might want to take that seriously. And then when it says, but there's one person who had a mode of being that protected him from that, that's also something you might want to take seriously, because you might want to know what that mode of being is, because you might need to use it. And so these sorts of things are practical in the deepest possible sense. They're real in the deepest possible sense, and practical in the deepest possible sense. This idea is what enables people to transcend their suffering. And Buddha said, well, don't be too attached to things. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean deny the world. It might mean deny the world if you're too in love with the material, like with material well-being, let's say, then your pathway to transcendence and meaning might be to abandon that, because it's constraining you. It's making you less than you could be. But the fundamental lesson, the more fundamental lesson that's underneath that is, don't let what you are stop you from being what you could be. Right. And so then the question is, well, what do you identify with? Do you identify with what you are? Then you're a tyrant. Do you identify with chaos? Because that's the opposite of order, say. Then you're nihilistic. Well, you don't identify with either of those. You know that they're both necessary. You know that you have to live with both of them, but you identify with the capacity to continually transcend what you are. And then you seek out error. That's what humility is. It's like, I'm error-ridden. It's like, so I want to put myself in a situation where I can discover one of my errors, hopefully not in a way that's going to knock me completely out of the game, right? I want to seek out a challenge. I want to find out where my limits are. I want to find out where there's not enough of me yet. And I want to do that in a way that's engaging, because, you know, you can wear yourself out fighting dragons, obviously. You can exhaust yourself completely, and that's not helpful. You know, one of the things I learned, for example, when I was coaching lawyers, these were people who had very high-end careers, and so they had an infinite workload. No matter how much they worked, flat out, there was always way more work that they should do. It's a very difficult thing to learn to manage. And so they were exhausting themselves, and I said, well, you know, you have to work less per day. It's like, well, no, that's not happening. I can't do that. And so what I learned over time was, okay, so this is what you have to do. Every 3 months you have to block off 4 days and go have a vacation. And you have to plan that in advance so it's in your calendar so that your secretary doesn't book your time. And then you need that because you have to recuperate enough so that you can work as hard as you're going to work. And of course they were nervous about that. And I said, well, look, we can calibrate this. Let's keep track of your billable hours over the next year and see if they increase or decrease, because I bet you if you take more time off, you'll actually have more billable hours. You'll actually have your cake and eat it too. You'll get to have a vacation and you'll be more productive. And that inevitably, that was what happened. And so that's a matter of calibrating the game properly, right? You want to play a game that you can play today, but also one that you can play next week and next month. We're not talking about, you know, your career this week. We're talking about you having a career that lasts 30 years, that doesn't kill you, that doesn't make you hate yourself or the job, that doesn't make you bitter, that doesn't wear you to a frazzle. So it has to be optimized. And so I think that you can, in fact, decide to take on the load that's optimally meaningful if you want, and then you get to have your cake and eat it too. You're on the pathway to continual incremental improvement. You only have to burn off a feather at a time instead of having the whole bloody thing burst into flames. But it's a constant source of renewal. And there's an idea that to be renewed, you have to drink the water of life, right? That's an old mythological idea. And what's the water? The water of life, chaos is water. Water is chaos. Water is what washes away too much order. And to stay continually, let's say, refreshed by the water of life is to take on exactly the right amount of chaos to make sure that your garden is properly nourished. And I think meaning is actually the marker of that. And as I said, you know that I wouldn't consider myself either naive or particularly optimistic person. I don't think I'm either of those. But this is actually an idea, this is one of the only ideas that I've ever found that I really believe to be rock solid. I actually think that it's true. And it's very optimistic because it says you can use your sense of meaning to calibrate your progress through life. But there's rules. You have to aim at the highest possible good that you can conceive. Don't sacrifice who you could be for who you are, which means if you have to choose to transform in a positive direction or maintain your current position, then it's better to transform in a positive direction. So you might even think of that as the core of your being. That's a Piagetian idea. It's a Jungian idea as well. Who are you? You're the thing that transforms who you are. Now you're also who you are, but on top of that, you're the thing that transforms who you are. And I do think that that's not an arbitrary statement. You know, one of the things that modern universities do dreadfully now is convince their students that value structures are relative, and that's a big mistake. There's a lot of things wrong with that idea, and one of the things that's wrong with that idea is that doesn't include what I just mentioned, which is that's a good moral rule, is you are the thing that is and you're the thing that becomes, and you should put the thing that becomes at a higher place than the thing that is. That means you also have to allow yourself to shake off those things about you that you might be pathologically attached to, habits and people, for that matter, ways of thinking, all of those things. You have to allow yourself to shake those off, and that's more like a burning. That's why the phoenix is the symbol that it is, right? It's old and it deteriorates, it bursts into flame, and then it's reborn. It's like, well, do you want to be reborn? It's like, well, that's not the question. The question is, do you want to burst into flame? And the answer to that generally is no, but that's the wrong answer. The right answer is you let all that nonsense burn away. And you know, and you might say, well, I don't know what I should leave behind. And the answer to that is that's a lie. You know some of the things that you should leave behind. All you have to do is ask yourself. You'll come up with a list instantly of 100 stupid things that you're doing that you know you could stop doing. Some of them maybe you don't know you could stop doing. It's like, well, fine, leave those alone for now. But there's a bunch of things you perfectly know well that you could stop doing that would improve your life. And so do that, see what happens. That's a good idea. All right. So it's personality and its transformations, because partly I wanted to talk to you about what you are as a human being and also as an individual, but also what you could become. And that's actually a crucial question in the domains of clinical psychology in particular, because a lot of what you're doing with people as a clinician is trying to figure out who they could become. That's right. You have a problem, your life isn't what it could be. It's like, fine, let's see what it could be like if we changed it. We'll figure out how to change it. That's got to be a negotiated dialogue, right? Because like, I don't know what the hell you should do with your life. I can help you figure it out, maybe. We can talk about it, but you are the person who has to decide if the things that you're aiming for, you know, get you out of bed in the morning, because that's really that's at least one of the crucial issues. So you got to specify the goal. And then you got to specify the transformation processes and start practicing them. And you have to understand that you're going to be bad at it, but it doesn't matter, because bad's fine. Persistent is what you need to be. If you persist, with tiny improvements, if you persist, you win. So you start by aiming at the star you can see rather than the dimmer one that you can't yet perceive. And then you decide that you're going to do that honestly, right? That's a big decision. So the first decision, I think, in some sense, is a decision of love. You're going to decide that being is worthwhile and that you're going to work for its betterment. And that's a decision that's based on love. And the second decision is based on truth. Having made that decision, you're going to play a straight game. Having made those two decisions, I think that you can allow your sense of meaning to calibrate your pathway. And then what's so interesting is that you hit a state that's as close to paradisal as you're going to hit right away, because being engaged like that, it's better to be engaged in the solution of a complex problem than not to have a problem at all. And that's no different than saying it's better for there to be being than non-being, because being is a problem. And so if you want to have no problems, then you have no being. And you could say, well, being is so miserable that maybe that's the route we should take. And fair enough, but maybe you can have your cake and eat it too. You can have the damn problem. It can be a problem worth solving, and you can be so engaged in solving the problem that it justifies the fact that the problem exists. And then you get to have the problem and the solution at the same time, and maybe that's better than not having the problem at all. And I believe that, because one of the things I have seen, and I've seen this being so interesting when I've been lecturing to people, especially more recently, and this is also manifested itself on YouTube. I'm talking to people a lot about responsibility, and it's young men in particular that seem to be responding to that. And I think that's partly because I think that young women, in some sense, have their responsibility map already laid out for them. It's also less voluntary in some sense for women, because they have more complicated problems to solve in the first part of their life, right? Because they have to get the family problem solved. But whatever. I've been talking in a very delineated manner about responsibility, which is a strange thing to sell to people, but responsibility is what gives your life meaning. And so then you might say, well, then take on ultimate responsibility. And what happens? You have an ultimately meaningful life. And then you might say, well, if your life is ultimately meaningful, doesn't matter if it's punctuated by tragedy or even predicated on tragedy. It's worth it. Everything I've seen indicates to me that's true. Every time I get my clients to take on more responsibility, and it isn't an injunction. You're a bad person, you should take on responsibility. It has nothing to do with that. You can define the damn responsibility. It isn't something that someone else should impose on you. It's not a matter of doing what you should do in some abstract manner. It's not that. It's the choice of what game you're going to play. And you can play the game of the seeker, I would say, and if you play that game, then everyone wins. And it's the best game you can play. And so the answer, in some sense, to the tragedy of life, to the catastrophe of life, to the fall, is to adopt the responsibility of mortality that goes along with that, and to play that game maximally. And paradoxically, it's in the willingness to do that that the solution emerges.